Hey everybody, it's Noah, and I'm happy to welcome you back to Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast. This week, we will be getting acquainted with two new characters in our evolving drama. Whether this drama will be a comedy or a tragedy depends largely on these two characters, as moving forward, they will be working in the highest echelon of the Department of Education in the city of New York, directly beneath Mayor-elect Adams. Both were introduced this past week, so there hasn't been much time for them to speak to their plans and goals, but already there is a lot of information out there for us to read and interpret. So that is the goal for today's episode, to see if there are any clues out there as to what we might expect starting January 1st. Our new Chancellor, taking office on the first of the year alongside Mayor-elect Adams, will be David C. Banks. Mr. Banks has spent the past 13 years as president and CEO of the Eagle Academy Foundation. His compensation in that role in 2020 was $292,548. So the $363,346 that Chancellor Porter started at back in 2020 will be a nice hefty step up for him. And likely his compensation will be even a bit higher than that due to inflation considerations. We can only hope he extends those same considerations to us teachers when we begin our contract negotiations this year. And speaking of teachers, when was the last time Mr. Banks was in the classroom? That part of his history as an educator is a little bit murkier. He doesn't spend hardly any time talking about his work as a teacher in his book about schools, and his LinkedIn work history begins with the founding of Eagle Academy. He did work as a teacher, though, beginning in 1986 in PS 167. However long he spent teaching, it was the shortest of his career segments, as he had already finished up law school at St. John's by 1993. Actually, his law career might be the shortest career stint, as he got his administration and supervision license within 2 years of becoming a lawyer, at which point he transitioned to working as an AP at PS 191. In 1997, he became the founding principal of the Bronx School for Law, Government, and Justice, where he worked for 7 years before passing the baton to then future Chancellor Misha Porter, who similarly had not spent very much time in the classroom, a mere 1.5 years, in fact, before becoming an AP. At that point, Mr. Banks founded the Eagle Academy, the first all-boys school founded within the DOE in 30 years. He worked as principal there for a little over 4 years before transitioning to his most recent title as president and CEO of the nonprofit Eagle Academy Foundation. If you tuned in to last week's Patreon episode, you will know that the public-private nonprofit continuum in education poses some really interesting challenges in determining motive. Nonprofits end up being a channel for large corporate interests to impact policy in ways that favor them, like in the case of the Walton family, the owners of Walmart, having a lot more sway in the realm of education than they should, because they can afford to throw millions of dollars every year, not at the taxes that fund public schools, but at nonprofits that do research and advocacy work meant to sway policymakers in one direction or the other. The thing is, when Walmart funds your advocacy and research, probably the conclusions have already been drawn ahead of time, and it's just in one direction that you'll likely be swaying the policymakers. In his book, Mr. Banks writes at length about how his brother Philip had a tough time in school because he was hyperactive and couldn't seem to focus on his schoolwork. Teachers were constantly coming to young David, who had an easier time in school, to exert some influence on his brother. This experience and the recognition that schools aren't really built to ensure the success of every child serves as Mr. Banks's raison d'être. It's the reason he starts teaching to begin with. It's the reason he does night classes and admin while working as a lawyer, and it's the reason for founding Eagle Academy later on. Like any reader interested in narrative threads, though, I just wanted to know how his brother turned out. Turns out Philip Banks III went on to become a cop. He managed to rise through the ranks to chief of department, where he worked for a year before resigning in the midst of a corruption scandal. It seems the FBI was investigating him as a result of $300,000 magically appearing in his bank account one day. And rather than stay and clear things up, he seems to have decided it would be best to resign. So, take from that what you will. He is considered an unindicted co-conspirator in the Rechnitz-Reichberg police bribery scandal. Mayor-elect Eric Adams doesn't seem to mind, though, as this Banks has been advising him on public safety matters. At any rate, we're not as interested in the past as we are in the future when it comes to Mr. Banks. So my key takeaways here are that he is pretty far removed from the classroom, but also pretty far removed from school administration. His classroom experience is fairly limited to begin with. I suspect I might actually have a bit more time in the classroom under my belt than he does, and I do not by any means feel ready to tell anybody else how to teach. He's wealthy, and he has been living in New Jersey for quite a while, so he is certainly a man after Eric Adams's heart, but might not have so much in common with teachers, as our work relegates us to the working class, although there are plenty of DOE teachers who do commute from New Jersey. That was just a little jab at Eric Adams, who of course had a really hard time with questions about his residency during the lead up to the most recent Democratic primary. I'll try not to get sidetracked here, though. The crux of the issue is this. Probably we don't want someone who worked as a classroom teacher last year to then transition to working as chancellor. These are two very different jobs. However, if your chancellor hasn't run a classroom since 1990, what kind of support are they likely to be able to offer in 2022? If they have been out of public education since 2008, moreover, what reason could there be to bring them back now? Think about it this way. If I, as a tenured classroom teacher, leave the DOE, I have only a 5-year window to return and submit a withdrawal of resignation before I have to start over from square one. I think that's reasonable. What is perhaps not so reasonable is allowing the 13-year grace period to pursue a career in the nonprofit sector not to count against Mr. Banks in the running to become the next chancellor. But let's take a moment to hear from Mr. Banks himself.
Eric Adams is not yet mayor of New York City, but his administration is already taking shape. And today, he named veteran educator David Banks as school's chancellor. Banks is a former teacher and principal who founded a network of all-boys public schools. Eyewitness News political reporter Dave Evans is live at City Hall with the very latest. Dave.
Lauren, this morning, Eric Adams, he really didn't have that much to say, and also his selection to be Chancellor, David Banks. They really didn't talk that much about issues facing New York City schools, such as the Gifted and Talented program, also integrating the schools. They didn't even have that much to say about how the pandemic has adversely affected our schools. Instead, they talked about the overarching theme of how our schools need to change. And they both had a warning for officials at the Department of Education next to City Hall at the old Tweed Courthouse. They told them that they might have some reason to worry about their future.
I want to present to you the next chancellor of the city of New York, David Banks.
Early this morning, the next mayor introduced his new school chancellor in front of where David Banks went to elementary school, PS 161 in Crown Heights. Come January 1st, Banks will run the nation's largest school system. And today he vowed dramatic change in every single school.
We are getting ready to not just play around with this. We're going to turn over the tables. That's what the mayor-elect told me.
The mayor-elect today tore into New York City schools, blasting officials for spending $38 billion every year and getting little to show for it.
We are in a city with 65% of black and brown children never reach proficiency, and we act like that's normal. That's right. It's all right. Let me tell you something. If 65% of white children were not reaching proficiency in this city, they will burn this city down.
David Banks founded the Eagle Academy for Boys, giving black and brown young men a second chance at college. He's from the city. His father was a cop, his mom a secretary. And the teachers union today praised Banks as a breath of fresh air, not so focused on Tweed, the education department's building headquarters.
Education happens in a school building. It does not happen in that building. And that building is not concerned about what goes on inside of a school.
I have not accepted this assignment because I wanted to be chancellor. I didn't come looking for a job. I came to do a job.
And David Banks has been a close advisor to Eric Adams for many years now. They are good friends. And Banks' wife, she is head of the United Way in New York City. She's also directing the transition for Eric Adams. She is head of that team for Eric Adams when he takes office here at City Hall on January 1st.
A little personal fun fact about this clip. The school at which Mr. Banks is speaking is PS 161, which is where I cut my teeth on teaching violin after school while I was doing my degree and getting my initial certificate. So that's a school that is very close to my heart. But now on to what Mr. Banks had to say. For starters, when he references Tweed, he's talking about the central headquarters for the NYC DOE, which is housed in Tweed Courthouse. I don't think anybody would disagree that Tweed isn't providing us with much value for the cost. In fact, when they sent central employees from Tweed out to the schools to deal with the hemorrhage of teachers at the time of the vaccine mandate, the people who showed up from Tweed were not very good. I'm just speaking anecdotally here, but the people I met from Tweed were not just bad at teaching and all things school related. They seemed to be just plain generally incompetent. Like I wouldn't trust them to assemble a piece of furniture, bake a batch of cookies using a recipe, follow directions on a map, or anything else I can think of really. I don't know what they do, but whatever it is, they can't possibly do it very well. Yet, a lot of the people there earn pretty hefty salaries. I'm not convinced that's where most of the $38 billion budget comes from, but Banks has identified a real crowd-pleasing stance nonetheless. Nobody's going to take up the cause for Tweed. Tweed doesn't have any friends among teachers, really. All that said, I did happen upon a really nice TripAdvisor review of the Tweed Courthouse. Nora P. writes, "This is where the head honchos of the NYC Department of Education have their offices. Beautifully maintained municipal building, but generally closed to the public, except for public tours held usually on Fridays. Go up long flight of stairs and ask security guard for brochure about public tours, which has phone number to call." So that's kind of nice. But the diatribe against Tweed and Tweed alone was enough to win Mr. Banks a glowing, if brief, statement from Michael Mulgrew, which is as follows. "David Banks is an educator who cares deeply about children. We have worked well with David in the past, and we look forward to continuing that relationship as he takes on the challenge of running 1,600 schools still suffering from the effects of the pandemic." Another thing that is basically universally agreed upon by stakeholders in New York City public schools is that the 65% figure Mr. Banks references is abominable. Those of us who found our way into teaching for the purpose of doing some good in our society did it for statistics like this one. We put up with all of the absurdities of our working conditions for this very reason, because we want to change these statistics for the better. So we're not surprised when we hear about these statistics, and we're every bit as outraged as we were when we took up this profession. But what we really want to know is the how. It's not new information for us, but a different take on how to fix it perhaps would be. The thing is, if you control for poverty, the statistics look very different. In New York City, schools are segregated not only by race, but also by poverty. and it's at the same time. Research shows that the causal variable when it comes to levels of academic performance is exposure to poverty. Now, is there racism baked into the Department of Education? Yes, of course, 100%. It's in the curriculum. It's in the discipline system. It's in hiring practices. And it's in the origin of standardized testing. As the SAT's author, Carl Brigham, was a eugenicist. That said, as intertwined as they are, any attempt to address systemic racism in education without reference to poverty will be missing a major piece of the puzzle. So that leads us to the big question. We already know about educational inequity. We already know this educational inequity is most directly tied to poverty. But is the new plan likely to address that poverty? Because, poverty has a pretty simple solution: redistribution of wealth. Wealthy people tend not to arrive at that conclusion, however, as the wealth has to come from somewhere. And that somewhere would most likely be the wealthy people who benefit from the status quo. This is all speculative, though. We haven't learned anything specific thus far about nuts and bolts. In fact, Mr. Banks told reporters at this first speaking engagement that he did that he wouldn't be talking at all about gifted and talented programming, which is a driver of even more intense segregation in the DOE. His first television appearance was thus intentionally free of actual details. His second was less so. So let's hear from Mr. Banks in his most recent television appearance on how he plans to shake things up.
Well, he is the city's new schools chancellor, and today David Banks sat down with News 4's Melissa Russo to talk about how exactly he wants to shake up the school system.
Help is on its way.
In the Eric Adams administration, there will be reading, writing, and corporate responsibility.
Are you envisioning a system where companies are asked to adopt a school?
Let me tell you something. That is going to be our North Star.
Incoming schools chancellor David Banks wants to engage the private sector in public schools. He's proved it can work in his Eagle Academy network, which pulls in private money and mentors.
Do you see this as a voluntary thing?
I don't think that the clarion call has ever gone out for them to be more involved in the lives of public school students, and that call is going to go out under our administration.
What's working at Eagle Academy that you could see being scaled citywide to public schools?
Young men at Eagle have mentors, and these are men who are lawyers and doctors and architects and bankers. We can scale that across the city.
How about some of the other things that you're doing that are working, like a longer school day, kids being in school on Saturday?
Absolutely critical. The unions, teachers very often may say, I don't want to work on a Saturday. I don't want to work all year long. But if we continue to do things the way that we've been doing them, we'll continue to get the same results.
Banks says if teachers don't want to work Saturdays or summers, he'll bring in community groups. He talks a lot about breaking the mold.
We can have access to the best teachers around the world. It shouldn't be limited to just the teacher that's in their classroom.
We are in a city with 65% of black and brown children never reach proficiency, and we act like that's normal.
Banks wants to change how children are taught to read and retrain early childhood teachers to emphasize phonics, sounding out the words.
I know the way I learned to read was through a phonetic approach to reading, and I think we're going to be looking to get back to that, because if you don't establish a very solid foundation and a core for reading at its inception in the early grades, everything you do, you're just fighting an uphill battle.
But he says those changes will take some time.
We're going to try to move as quickly as we can.
Some believe an interim solution is to open more charter schools. Former Mayor Michael Bloomberg just last week pledged $750 million to support charters across the country, but the city is maxed out on opening new charters unless the state votes to lift its cap.
Like Adam said yesterday, we want to scale excellence. So if that means opening a few more charter schools, that's what we're going to do.
If you can get the state to approve it.
If we can get the state to approve it. I'm encouraging Mayor Bloomberg, the philanthropic community, CEOs of major companies to lean in on the traditional public school system. Because at the end of the day, most of our children will continue to go to our traditional public schools.
Melissa Russo, News 4, New York.
There you have it. There's a lot to unpack here. First of all, there is a lot of research out there on the importance of a move towards a more phonics-based literacy paradigm. But that's how I learned is not the most compelling argument and not what you might expect to hear from a school's chancellor. One can only hope that someone in the room is doing some research and not blindly following the chancellor's memories of his youth when developing policy. Corporate responsibility is a really interesting turn of phrase here, as I would more likely assign that term to the root causes of educational inequity at this point than to probable solutions. This is our chancellor of the New York City Department of Education, yet he sounds very much like the head of a charter network. Corporate capital isn't free. It has tremendous costs in the form of a de-democratization of what is meant to be a public good. Corporations have their own interests, whether they be in shaping curriculum, preparing human resources, or getting ahead of potential public relations issues. Perhaps most pressingly for us teachers and laborers, and as you might recall from last week's episode, large corporations hate unions, whereas public schools in the city are run by unionized labor. This irreconcilable difference can be held at bay as long as public institutions draw support from public resources. But as long as corporate money has a way into public institutions, it has the potential to hold sway. And speaking of unions, did you notice how Mr. Banks brought up Saturdays and summers? That's very crafty, and this is possibly the most important part of the episode thus far. He's not even officially chancellor yet, but Mr. Banks has tipped his hand. Public opinion on teachers across the country is polarized at the moment. On the one hand, we are teaching in person, so nobody can resent us for working remotely. We're in the building, so people can send their kids somewhere every day. That said, the one thing that makes teachers look bad at the moment has to do with our contractual hours. Summer vacation seems to make people's blood boil. The stage is set for a tremendous hit in public opinion if teachers demonstrate any lack of grace over the discussion of our hours. Here's the thing, many schools across the DOE already have Saturday programming. After-school programming happens pretty much everywhere. Summer Rising was a DOE-wide program this summer. I personally love having the opportunity to teach after school. Also Saturday school, also summer school, because these are really the only places where I can put together any sort of continuity in my music ensembles. So that's just me speaking as a music teacher. But plenty of teachers are happy to have the opportunity to work outside of their contractual hours. The thing is, you get paid per session for this, right? It's outside of the hours of your contract. So, for non-DOE teachers out there, this is essentially overtime pay. It's great, and there are a lot of us doing it already. And Mr. Banks has no evidence or reason to believe that we, as teachers or as union members, would be unwilling to continue to engage in this work outside of our contractual hours. So why would he bring this up and then generate a straw man argument that teachers are unwilling to work Saturdays and summers? Why would this be his first shot across the bow at his first mention of our union? Well, check the comments on videos of this coverage wherever they're posted. If there's one thing that will destroy any public support we've gathered by going back into schools in the middle of a global pandemic, it is complaints about the proposition of working longer hours. If there's one thing that strengthens a negotiating position in the middle of a contract negotiation, it's a strike. And if there's one thing that makes a strike difficult, it's the loss of public support. For this reason, I implore you, friends and colleagues, think about the long game before engaging with any sort of negative feedback online about Mr. Banks's proposal. It's a strategic shot across the bow, nothing more. And we have to look good this year. We don't just need to do good. That goes without saying. And nobody needs to remind us of that. but we also need to look good. The other use of this straw man argument, the idea that teachers don't want to work summers and Saturdays, remember, of course, many of us already do and really appreciate the opportunity to work summers, Saturdays after school, is that it opens up the possibility of replacing teachers with CBOs, or community-based organizations. Keep in mind, Mr. Banks does not work in a school. He works in a nonprofit. So his work is to interface with organizations, fundraise, attend events, and that sort of thing. To a hammer, every problem is a nail. So the problem of teacher unwillingness to work longer hours, again, a false problem that is invented, can be solved by interfacing with outside organizations. Some of these would be nonprofits, like Mr. Banks' own nonprofit, but some might be private organizations. Regardless, there would be a cost associated with bringing in these organizations. So if we are hoping some of that $38 billion that Mayor-elect Adams has identified for redistribution might go towards alleviating poverty, these hopes might be left unanswered. Rather, it seems we will continue to dance around the central problem of poverty while outside organizations come in, do their thing with no accountability in place other than securing a signature from an administrator and get paid out of that huge budget. Again, I think the main takeaway from this interview is that the incoming administration is already on something of a war footing. And we need to gather up as much popular support as we can muster, especially with a contract negotiation coming up this year. This is likely the first of many negative portrayals of us and our union, and the first of many suggestions that if teachers won't do it, then the best thing to do is bring in outside groups, private groups, nonprofit groups. Our best response, I think, is to be graceful and remember that procession is in place for a reason. A put-me-in-coach attitude is our best move and the best way to call their bluff, since probably Mr. Banks and Mr. Adams are not as concerned with keeping kids in school for longer hours as they are with discrediting teachers and paying off their associates in the private and nonprofit sectors. And speaking of the private and nonprofit sectors, the recently announced incoming first deputy chancellor is Dan Weisberg, who, as luck would have it, was briefly the subject of last week's Patreon episode in his capacity as CEO of TNTP and a board member for E4E, both of which are Walton family-funded nonprofits supporting the influx of corporate money and, more importantly, influence into the public school system. Mr. Weisberg is not, nor has he ever been, a teacher. In fact, he is a labor lawyer by training who worked for the DOE under the Bloomberg administration and basically just fought the UFT. That was his job. His goal was to dismantle seniority, and he did not succeed, but he was really a thorn in the side of the UFT throughout his time in the DOE. Since he left the DOE, he has worked as the CEO of TNTP, the New Teacher Project, which is a nonprofit founded by Wendy Kopp, who also founded Teach for America. It is a tremendous tilt of the hand that the CEO of what is on its face a research and advocacy organization for teachers is headed by an anti-union labor lawyer. But even more of a tilt of the hand that this same anti-union labor lawyer is poised to become first deputy chancellor of the New York City Department of Education. While we might be a little concerned about Mr. Banks for having been out of school for a little too long, we have infinitely more reason for concern that Mr. Weisberg has never worked in a school and has only worked to try and take things away from the people who do work in schools. Dan Weisberg, though not an educator nor really anybody with the credential or background to speak with any authority on the state of the education system, writes a lot of blog posts for TNTP. Here's something he wrote in 2020.
The biggest scandal in education is hiding in plain sight, by Dan Weisberg. Kids hear all the time that working hard and earning A's and B's in school will open opportunities for them later in life. Families rely on those grades to tell them whether their kids are getting what they need out of school to become happy, successful adults. In fact, they trust report card grades more than standardized test scores or any other indicator of their kids' progress. Unfortunately, for millions of families, report card grades are deeply misleading, offering false confidence that their children are well prepared for their futures when they're not. Earlier this month, the Fordham Institute released a study that further confirmed this scandal that's hiding in plain sight in almost every school in the country. The study found huge variation in grading standards among Algebra 1 teachers in North Carolina, meaning that an A or a B might reflect very different levels of mastery from classroom to classroom. Grading standards depended not on policy, but on factors like the teacher's experience level, the selectivity of the college they attended, and even their gender. Crucially, these different grading standards had a significant impact on students. According to the study, students learned more from teachers with higher grading standards.
Now, that post itself doesn't strike much of a chord in one way or another. Grade inflation and arbitrary differences in expectations is, anecdotally at least, something a lot of us encounter in the profession. That said, the reliance on the Thomas B. Fordham Foundation for data is hugely problematic, as Dr. Carol Burris explains in the following. A recent study published by the Thomas B. Fordham Institute entitled Robbers or Victims, Charter Schools and District Finances was rolled out with fanfare and sent to policymakers across the country. When the Fordham Institute sent out its mass email trumpeting its report, its subject line read, "New report finds charter schools pose no fiscal threat to local districts." In the report and its public relations campaign, Fordham cynically attempts to razzle-dazzle the reader with misleading conclusions based on questionable data in hopes of convincing the public that charter schools do no financial harm to public schools. The Walton Foundation and the Fordham Foundation, the Fordham Institute's related organization, funded the study. It is worth noting that the Fordham Foundation sponsors 11 charter schools in Ohio, for which it receives administrative fees. If you are curious about where the Fordham Foundation gets its money, here's a little something from Media Matters. The Thomas B. Fordham Institute is an education-focused conservative think tank with a stated mission to advance high standards and quality education options for families through research and advocacy. Its board of trustees includes former George W. Bush-era Secretary of Education Rod Page, the CEO of a controversial Los Angeles public charter school group, and the head lobbyist for College Board. The current president of the Fordham Institute, Michael Petrilli, is also an executive editor of Education Next, and the Fordham Institute co-sponsors Education Next's publication. The Institute produces education news commentary through a weekly newsletter and a well-known blog called Flypaper, and it publishes its original research through opinion pieces placed in various state and national media outlets. While the Institute is based in Washington, D.C., it also manages 2 on-the-ground offices in Ohio, where it has sponsored charter schools since 2004 and produces Ohio-specific school choice research and advocacy materials. The Fordham Institute is listed as an associate member of the State Policy Network of Conservative Think Tanks, an allied organization of the American Federation for Children, and an education partner of the right-wing-fueled National School Choice Week campaign. The Fordham Institute is a national policy partner of the Policy Innovators in Education Network, and Petrilli serves on the network's board. It lists many additional partners on its website, including 50CAN, the American Enterprise Institute, Education Next, several charter school associations, the Foundation for Excellence in Education, Students First, Stand for Children, and the American Legislative Exchange Council. Tax filings show that the Thomas B. Fordham Institute has received $182,500 from the Bradley Foundation since 2012. If you, like me, didn't know about the Bradley Foundation, here's a little something on them, too. The Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation is a private foundation considered to be one of the chief funders of the conservative nonprofit world and a bigger, darker right-wing funder than the Koch brothers, operating with assets estimated to top $800 million amassed from defense contracts. The Bradley Foundation grants millions to conservative organizations ranging from advocacy groups to think tanks specializing in a number of issues, including education. The foundation was estimated to have given as much money as the 7 Koch and Scaife foundations combined from 2001 to 2009. Investigative writer Jane Meyer wrote that the Bradley Foundation virtually drove the entire national school choice movement, waging an all-out assault on teachers' unions and traditional public schools. Evidence shows the Bradley Foundation has also used its home state of Wisconsin as a testing ground for its privatization efforts. A 2015 report from the nonprofit One Wisconsin Now concluded that the foundation had spent over $108 million in support of education privatization from 2005 to 2014 in Wisconsin and nationwide. The Bradley Foundation is credited as a major backer and influencer of Republican Governor Scott Walker, whose tenure as Wisconsin governor has included the expansion of voucher programs, severe cuts to funding for public education, and the passage of corporate-backed American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, right-to-work model legislation that severely weakened unions and was found to be unconstitutional by a Wisconsin state court in April. The Bradley Foundation has also been identified as the true author of the Friedrichs versus California Teachers Association case, a failed attempt to bust unions that went to the Supreme Court after being litigated by the Bradley and Koch-backed Center for Individual Rights, and was supported with amicus briefs filed by several members and affiliates of the right-wing state policy network of think tanks, many of which also received funding from the Bradley Foundation. The foundation awards an annual Bradley Prize for Journalism. Past recipients include conservative columnist George Will and several Wall Street Journal columnists and editorial board members. So, at this point, you might be imagining that Professional Development Studios International is a closet with a corkboard and yarn tracing conspiracy theories from one organization to the next, to this paranoid belief that public education is under threat. You're not wrong about the closet part. We are in New York after all. However, these relationships are out there in plain sight. I mean, Weisberg is a labor lawyer for the other team. It doesn't get any clearer than that. And it's worth knowing these things because these individuals are about to take on the role of public official. They will be speaking with the authority of their office and making choices that will impact the lives of our students and us as well. I am always prepared to offer up the benefit of the doubt, but I'm also fiercely protective of my students, of the profession of teaching, and the access to good teaching that I think every student deserves. All that said, let's see how it goes. Let's see what the plan looks like on January 1st, but let's also keep an eye on the corkboard because the yarn tracing these relationships and motivations is already there. We didn't make it up. And so with that, episode 20 of Professional Development, the New York City Teacher Podcast, draws to a close. If you like what you're hearing, consider leaving a nice review wherever you do your podcast listening. I have no idea how the algorithm works, but it couldn't hurt, right? Consider also checking out the Patreon site, where for a mere $3 per month, you'll get 2 extra episodes and whatever other bonus goodies we can think of. That's at patreon.com/professionaldevelopment. Finally, we love to hear from listeners with constructive criticism and glowing reviews alike. So please do not hesitate to reach out at professionaldevelopmentpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week.